Well, Excellency, that was a great talk about what we're facing here, and I want to commend Congressman Pittenger for leading this effort. I think it's very, very valuable, particularly the international nature of it. I have to say we're coming up on 25 years of this new century, and it's also almost 25 years since 9/11. And it's caused me to think back and conceive about how we were thinking about intelligence and security 25 years ago and how different it is now, and what are the lessons we can learn from that. 25 years ago, you'll recall, it was the decade after the Berlin Wall fell. It looked like Russia was on its way to becoming a more or less free country. The Soviet Union was gone. In China, the Americans looking at China believed that the liberalization of the economy would inevitably generate more impulse to have democracy, even though there'd been setbacks like Tiananmen Square. And as a particular author famously wrote, it looked like we were at the end of history. Now we're going to have world peace and prosperity. All the bad guys are going to go away, and life is going to become just like the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, September 11th came, and that was the culmination of less dramatic acts of terrorism over the preceding decade, and it was an enormous shock to the system. And just to give you a personal note, I was then the head of the criminal division of the Department of Justice on September 11th, and in those days, the responsibility for dealing with terrorism lay with that department. And so I spent that day and much of every single day in the weeks and months afterwards working with the director of the FBI to redesign our counterterrorism effort. One of the things that flowed out of that period of time, and also during the period I was Secretary at Homeland Security, is intelligence became very tactically focused. It all became about where's the next attack coming, where is this terrorist, what is the way someone might travel from point A to point B. Those were very valuable things, and we developed new technologies with satellites and other kinds of modern devices to help us pinpoint where the threats might be. But what happened was the strategic intelligence, analyzing things in the long term and looking where the long-term threats and opportunities might be, kind of took a back seat. Because when the president's interested in, tell me what the threat is next week, the intelligence community tends to focus a lot on next week and not next decade. And it may be because of that we missed some of the changes that were percolating in that first decade of this century. Changes in Russia with the rise and institutionalization of what I call Putinism, which is going back to a much more rigid strongman approach, or the fact that we had Xi Jinping coming, who was going to slow and then ultimately reverse the drive to a somewhat more open society and bring back a regime that was a little bit redolent of Maoism in terms of being autocratic. So as we look at what's transpired since September 11th, obviously it's still important that we focus on tactical intelligence and identifying, capturing, or incapacitating terrorists. But there are many, many more challenges we have to deal with from a security standpoint. And what's been very, I think, interesting about yesterday and today at the forum is the number of different kinds of topics that are now being recognized as dimensions of security. Because security, instead of being narrowly cabined, is now properly seen as something that touches almost on every element of human activity. So as far as intelligence is concerned, obviously the techniques of electronic surveillance, interception of messages, undercover activities, those are traditionally part of intelligence collection and analysis and will continue to be. But what I think we've learned is sometimes the best intelligence analysis comes from what's in plain sight, open source, because you have autocrats, for example, announcing what they're going to do. And what you need is the ability to use subject matter expertise, historical context, and perspective to understand what's being said and what the consequences of that might be. So in many ways, scholarship, of a traditional time is as important now in intelligence analysis as the ability to sneak in and grab something that's a secret plan on the part of an adversary. As far as a strategic look at the threats, I think to me the most significant element of particularly the last decade has been the slow but compelling recognition that conflict on a geopolitical basis now covers multiple domains. It's not simply restricted to the conventional battlefield, land, sea, and air. It's not just a matter of kinetic attacks, missiles and bombs and guns, but it covers things that used to be viewed as unrelated to security, as being the domain of the free market, for example, or being something that was involved with intellectual activity. And in fact, what we've learned is some of the most potent areas for conflict and danger and risk are these various domains. We'll start by talking about cyber. You know, when the internet was formed, it was originally meant to be just something used by academics and by the defense community as a way of maintaining resilient communications if the ordinary channels of communications failed. And then it was opened up to commercial use. And the initial concern, understandably, was that criminals would take advantage of that to steal money. And that happened, and it continues to happen. But it's not the only thing that's happened. It has now become a tool for the disruption or destruction of critical infrastructure. And one of the things you see is more and more it can be used not just to obtain ill-gotten gains, but to actually threaten and shut down government institutions and private institutions. A sad example of this is Ukraine, where for the past 5 years there have been Russian attacks that shut down the grid, electric grid, for periods of time around Christmas time. And then, of course, there was a NotPetya ransomware attack a few years ago, which used malware embedded in an accounting software package that was being used in Ukraine. That malware basically shut down and destroyed all the data that was being used by any office that was in Kyiv or similar big cities, including collateral damage to institutions that were, for example, Scandinavian, like Maersk, or the drug company Merck. So we began to see how cyber could become actually a weapon as powerful as a bomb, if not more powerful. More recently, we've seen the supply chain becoming a domain of conflict. Some of that emerges through, again, cyber issues, where in the SolarWinds attack of a couple of years ago, malware was embedded in a software package that was used by multiple entities to manage their network. And the software was infected and created an open door so that the bad guys could go in and use that to penetrate any company that had downloaded that package and used it. And so that infection basically allowed a skeleton key for criminals and for nation states to unlock any secure area that happened to use that network. We've seen supply chains, even physical supply chains, become again a domain of conflict. And we finally and belatedly recognized that if our chips and our semiconductors all come from China or are sourced in China and Taiwan, we are at risk if the Chinese decide to shut off trade with us, and if they decide to shut off our trade with Taiwan by using military force. Happily, that's led to our decision in the US and in other countries to invest more in chips and semiconductors in friendly nations and not to have a single source of supply. And yet another area of conflict, as we've seen, and we've heard in the last couple of days, is using economic leverage to control domains and physical domains of land, as well as to get access to and to control precious metals, minerals, and other natural resources, again, that are critical for our technologies, for having chips, and for our telecom industry. So now we're beginning to see that what we just saw a moment ago, the activities of the Chinese and the Russians in Africa, give them the expectation that they'll have leverage over what we depend upon to run our economies. So it's turned out to be that economics and sources of supply and rare earths and minerals are every bit as much a domain of conflict as the traditional go into the battlefield with tanks and guns. And our strategic planning and intelligence has to be built with the understanding that we need to see how all of these pieces fit together in order to make sure we are adequately protecting our security. Finally, I would say there are two other areas I'm going to briefly mention, again, which should become domains of conflict and have to become matters of strategic concern. One is space. Many of you may know the U.S. has constituted a space force. If you looked at the history of what happened in the Russian invasion of Ukraine a year ago, space was very important to Ukraine because it allowed satellites in orbit to basically convey messaging and communications and keep the internet open for Ukraine, which was very important in terms of their resistance to the Russians. What that tells us is we're also going to see damage and destruction and disruption of these critical assets in space. And finally, information. Because information, we've heard the term information warfare, but we've seen it vividly demonstrated in the last few years. And our adversaries have been particularly adept at using disinformation to undermine the unity of effort among Western nations and to sow discord, and perhaps even to undermine democracy itself. We're concerned about deep fakes, which are computer-generated images that appear to be absolutely real, that would purport to show, for example, that a national leader was committing crimes or was actually in the pay of a foreign power. And of course, this would be completely fabricated, but it would be very difficult to detect and might have the effect of swaying people's sentiments and confidence in their government. So a whole new area of strategic integration has to be how we look at our conventional and economic competition and conflict in the light of artificial intelligence and other tools that allow the weaponization of disinformation as a way of undermining our unity of effort. So lots to think about, and I guess my bottom line is this. The scope of what we have to be concerned about when we think about collecting intelligence is much greater than it was 25 years ago, and the scope of what we have to plan strategically is much greater. And so my takeaway lesson is as important as it is to have people still focus on the tactical and the individual steps that we need to do to protect ourselves, the people who lead our countries, whether it be in the executive branch or in the legislature, need to be able to step back and look at the big picture. And sometimes the big picture is more challenging and more complicated, but it's also in many ways more important than the individual tactical decisions that we make. So again, I think we're going to have another day today that's rich with considering these issues, and I commend you for your attentiveness, and thank you very much.